Hello, Dr. Jensen, and thank you for joining us today and leading our session on e-cigarettes and vaping. Can you give us a little bit of background on e-cigarettes and vaping?
So e-cigarettes now, since they first came on the marketplace in the mid-2000s, are now the #1 tobacco product used by teenagers. Around 20 to as high as 30% of teenagers report regular use of it. That's based off school-based studies. And I think it's important to really emphasize that e-cigarettes are tobacco products. The vast majority of them have nicotine in them. And why I say that is it's a reminder to all of us, tobacco products are the leading preventable cause of disease and death in the United States still. Teenagers who use cigarettes, dramatic decline over the last 30 years. We're down to about 8% report regular use. As I mentioned before, we're up to 20% of teens reporting regular kind of e-cigarette use. And something that we're most concerned about is that teenage e-cigarette users seem to be at a significantly increased risk, a 4 times increased risk of becoming regular cigarette smokers. Cigarette smoking, leading preventable cause of disease and death in the United States. Almost 500,000 people die every year from tobacco, from smoking in particular. The average smoker has 10 years taken off their life. So I want to start by just connecting this into a larger issue around tobacco. Again, e-cigarettes, vaping devices, these are tobacco products.
Great. Now to get into the questions. What are some substances found in e-cigarettes?
That's a great question. These products are not regulated by the FDA, so they have chemicals and products in them that are often advertised and not advertised to the user. The vast majority of the time, they usually have some sort of solution that contains flavors, nicotine, propylene glycol, which is something that makes it easier to be vaporized, and a whole bunch of other things. Things like heavy metals and volatile organic compounds that we know are strongly associated with development of cancer. And I emphasize the nicotine aspect to this as well. The vast majority of teens think that when they're using a product like Juul, for example, or other e-cigarettes, that they don't have nicotine in them. It's a product that always contains nicotine. We're starting to discover that nicotine really does hurt the adolescent developing brain. It seems to increase the risk of attention issues, so developing things like ADHD. And one of the biggest concerns is it primes the brain for future addiction to other chemicals. When you think about other drugs that we hear about, nicotine is actually more addictive, certainly than marijuana, than alcohol. It seems to be potentially more addictive than heroin, opioids, and cocaine, or at least in the same class. The concerning thing is that some studies start to identify that nicotine exposure primes your brain for exposure to other things and become addicted to other chemicals, other drugs, like opioids and like cocaine. So I think the big thing is people used to say that, oh, nicotine itself is not harmful. That's not true. It's the clear harm that comes from even just nicotine exposure, let alone kind of all the other chemicals that are part of these products.
Can e-cigarettes help people quit smoking, or are they a safe alternative to tobacco cigarettes?
They came onto the marketplace with a lot of misinformation that's out there right now. So it's important for people as they evaluate things to look at the credibility of the sources. Every e-cigarette company, pretty much, is owned by a big tobacco company. That's why I'm emphasizing these are tobacco products. Now, there are some researchers who analyze and say maybe these products could help people quit smoking, or they can be a harm reduction option. But what we want to emphasize is safer doesn't mean safe. There's some evidence to support that they have fewer chemicals, fewer harmful chemicals that I mentioned before compared to cigarettes. And there are a couple of research studies that show they might help people transition away from cigarettes. But that's for established adult cigarette smokers. There's another side to this. And what I like to emphasize is imagine tobacco use is a highway on a path towards disability, disease, and death. What you just asked the question was about the off-ramp. Could e-cigarettes help pull people off of this highway towards death? The evidence is not that clear. There's some things that point in the right direction, but it's kind of unclear compared to, there seems to be more compelling evidence, consistent findings in studies that find that non-users of e-cigarettes, of cigarettes to start, non-users of cigarettes, if they use e-cigarettes, they're much more likely to get pulled onto that highway of cigarette use and that highway towards disability, disease, and death. So the question is going to ask, could they help people quit? But it's part of another question of, are they actually pulling more people into harmful cigarette use? And so far, the data suggests that's the case. They're actually pulling more people in than they're actually helping people get off.
Thank you for that. What have scientific studies in mice indicated about the risk of vaping?
Another great question, because it's going to take time to do the human studies to figure out the long-term harms of these products. It took a long time to figure out that cigarettes actually cause lung cancer. It took about 30 years of kind of data and long-term studies. So we start with mice models, and the mice models are concerning. They show that things like the secondhand aerosol clearly affects individual mice. Things like the nicotine exposure potentially affects brain development, especially kind of newborn and adolescent mice brain development. And we're starting to see that it also affects lung function in mice as well. Now, the next question could be also about what do we know in human studies? And we're starting to see kind of concerning what we know so far is concerning, even though we don't have all the information. So, for example, we know about the secondhand exposure. We're getting more and more concerned about the nicotine exposure in teenagers. And there are some new studies that find that individual teenagers that use e-cigarettes compared to cigarettes compared to nothing have increased risk of developing asthma compared to never using cigarettes, and might actually have even different risk profiles than using cigarettes, meaning they might affect your lungs in different ways than we even are most concerned about with cigarettes.
What are options to help people quit smoking?
There are a whole bunch of FDA-approved treatment options that involve medication and or counseling. So the biggest one is a combination of all those different things. So you can start with talking to an individual that wants to quit smoking, can talk to their physician or a provider. They can get connected to free counseling available through the Quit line, 1-800-QUIT-NOW, in which they provide counseling over the phone or through text messaging. And there are other medication options. One is called nicotine replacement therapy, where it's usually the patch or gum or lozenges, kind of other different products like that, that really the idea being that it helps address the nicotine addiction, switching you from the cigarette to the nicotine that's available in these products, eventually getting off it. And there are other medications that affect the chemical pathways in your brain to help you push back against the addiction. Things called Zyban or bupropion or Chantix varenicline. These are other medications that are available through a prescription. So there are all these wonderful FDA-approved options that really do help people quit smoking when they're interested.
Great. Thank you so much for teaching us about vaping and the effects of e-cigarettes. Can you tell us a little bit more about your career path?
So I always knew my mother's a pediatrician, and I saw a great example of her kind of delivering great care to her patients, and that's kind of what intrigued me in the area. And I got pulled more into research. I was talking with different people, meeting with different kind of mentors. And one of the things that really struck me, I actually started by doing tobacco research, was where I grew up as a kid, I didn't see much tobacco advertising. I wasn't exposed to that much secondhand smoke. And when I started to do more community-based work around kind of meeting the needs of my patients, I found all these tobacco advertisements, all these different things targeted them in these underserved areas. And when I reached out and found mentors who were doing tobacco control work, I wanted to kind of help push back. And it was that interest in it started with trying to protect children, adolescents, young adults, and families from the tobacco abuse that kind of pulled me into this research area, trying to, on one level, develop interventions and study them to figure out how we can help people quit smoking, and then helping contribute in the public policy space, looking at what interventions we can do there to help protect people on a larger public health level. That's what really pulled me in. It was actually tobacco and realizing that my families and my patients were getting manipulated by tobacco companies that pulled me into the space.
Great. Thank you for joining us and taking the time to answer our questions. We really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me. If people are interested in more information, they can always look at our CHOP Policy Lab website, where we have more information about e-cigarettes and tobacco, and also checking out the American Academy of Pediatrics website that also has a lot of information about e-cigarettes, vaping, and tobacco.